General Hospital spoilers will reveal. After Sam's death, Jason's life shifted in a way that even he could not deny. For years, he had lived on the edge of danger without hesitation, accepting the risks that came with the world he had chosen. Violence, secrecy, and constant threats had become part of the rhythm of his existence. Yet even within that darkness, Sam had always been the one steady force that grounded him. She was the person who reminded him that there was still something human beneath the hardened exterior he showed to the world. Sam had a way of pulling Jason back whenever the shadows of his life threatened to swallow him completely. When she was gone, that balance disappeared overnight. What remained was not only grief, but an overwhelming realization that everything had changed. The life Jason had accepted for himself could no longer remain the same, because Danny was still there. Danny was now the only person whose future truly mattered. Jason understood with painful clarity that his son could not grow up surrounded by the same dangers that had followed Jason for most of his life. For the first time in many years, Jason began to look at his choices through a different lens. He was no longer thinking only about survival or loyalty or the endless conflicts that had shaped his identity. Instead, he was thinking about responsibility. Protecting Danny now meant planning for possibilities Jason had always tried to ignore. That realization led Jason to something he had avoided for far too long: revisiting his will. The document had been left untouched since the day Sam died, almost as if Jason had been unwilling to acknowledge the reality that his life was now more uncertain than ever. Sitting alone with the papers spread before him, Jason realized that the will represented more than legal instructions. It was the final safeguard he could create for Danny, a silent promise that his son would not be left alone in the world if something happened to him. Jason had lived with danger for so long that he rarely thought about his own mortality in a practical way. But now, every decision carried a different weight. Each line of the document forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about the future. If the life he lived eventually caught up with him, who would be there for Danny? Who could be trusted not only to care for him, but to understand the complicated reality that came with being Jason's son? As Jason read through the details, the issue of guardianship became the most difficult decision of all. Choosing someone to raise Danny meant more than selecting a responsible adult. It meant choosing someone who could shield him from the darker parts of Jason's world while still honoring the memory of the family Danny had already lost. While Jason struggled with those questions, Danny was dealing with grief in a way that only a child could. The loss of Sam had left a wound that Danny did not know how to express. To the outside world, his behavior appeared reckless and defiant, but beneath the surface, it was something much more fragile. Danny was trying to navigate emotions that felt too big for him to understand. Without his mother's presence to guide him, the confusion and pain inside him had nowhere to go. Instead of talking about what he felt, Danny began acting out. The once orderly guardhouse at the Quartermain estate became a reflection of his inner turmoil, cluttered and neglected. Skipping school became another silent rebellion, a way for Danny to escape the expectations that now felt impossible to meet. When Jason discovered what had been happening, he knew he could not ignore it any longer. He confronted Danny firmly, ordering him to clean the guardhouse and imposing a strict punishment by banning him from returning there for 2 months. On the surface, Jason's reaction seemed like simple discipline. But beneath the stern tone was a father who understood that Danny was hurting in ways words could not easily fix. Jason recognized that Danny's behavior was not just teenage stubbornness. It was grief manifesting in unpredictable ways. Losing Sam had shattered the emotional stability that once held their small family together. Danny had lost the person who always understood him without needing explanations. For Jason, watching his son struggle with that absence was one of the most painful experiences he had ever faced. Unlike the dangers he confronted in the outside world, this was a battle he could not solve with strategy or strength. Danny needed guidance, patience, and time. Yet, Jason feared that the chaos of his own life might prevent him from giving his son the stability he deserved. Every time Jason looked at Danny, he was reminded of the fragile line between the life he had lived and the life he hoped Danny could still have. That realization only deepened Jason's determination to make the right decisions about his will and Danny's future. As Jason continued reviewing the document, the weight of those decisions pressed heavily on him. The question of guardianship lingered in his mind long after he set the papers down. Whoever he chose would become the person responsible for protecting Danny from the very world Jason had spent his life navigating. That responsibility felt enormous, and Jason knew he could not afford to make the wrong choice. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that preparing the will was not just a precaution. It was a turning point in how Jason viewed his own life. For the first time, he was considering whether staying in Port Charles might ultimately place Danny in greater danger. The city was filled with memories and alliances, but it was also filled with enemies. If Jason truly wanted to give his son a chance at a safer future, he might eventually have to make the most difficult decision of all. And as that possibility slowly took shape in his mind, Jason realized that protecting Danny might require sacrifices he had never imagined before. After Danny walked away, the silence that settled in the room felt heavier than before. Jason remained standing there for a moment, his thoughts circling the same difficult questions that had been building in his mind for weeks. Eventually, he admitted to Alexis and Tracy that he had been reviewing his will, something he had not seriously considered since Sam died. The words immediately changed the mood in the room. Alexis and Tracy both understood Jason well enough to recognize that he was not the type of man who handled legal matters without a deeper reason. Jason rarely wasted time on things that were unnecessary, especially something as significant as revising his will. To them, his decision signaled that something serious was unfolding beneath the surface. Alexis felt an immediate sense of concern, while Tracy's sharp instincts told her that Jason was preparing for something far more dangerous than he was willing to admit. When they pressed him for answers, Jason offered only a calm explanation. He insisted that he was simply taking precautions, explaining that after Sam's death, he needed to ensure that Danny would always have someone to care for him if the worst were to happen. His tone was steady and controlled, but both women could sense that he was holding something back. Jason knew they were not fully convinced, yet he refused to reveal the deeper truth behind his decision. The reality was far more complicated than he was willing to discuss aloud. For most of his life, danger had been a constant presence. Enemies came and went, alliances shifted, and threats often faded only to return when least expected. Jason had survived countless confrontations over the years, but survival had never guaranteed safety. Now, with Danny growing older, Jason could no longer ignore the consequences of the life he had chosen. Port Charles was filled with people who respected him, but it was also filled with people who would happily use Danny as leverage if the opportunity ever arose. That thought alone was enough to keep Jason awake at night. The threats surrounding him had never truly disappeared. They had merely gone quiet for a time. Jason understood that sooner or later those dangers could return stronger than before. It was that realization that had pushed him to reconsider everything, including whether staying in Port Charles was the right choice at all. Gradually, a difficult idea began to take shape in Jason's mind, one that would have seemed impossible to him in the past. Leaving Port Charles might be the only way to protect Danny from the life that had defined Jason for so long. The thought was not about running away or abandoning the people he cared about. Instead, it was about removing Danny from the constant shadow of conflict that surrounded Jason's world. If Jason disappeared from the city, many of the enemies who had once targeted him might eventually lose interest. Without Jason present, there would be little reason for anyone to threaten Danny. The idea felt both painful and strangely logical at the same time. Port Charles held nearly every memory Jason had built over the years, including the memories of Sam. Yet those memories could not outweigh the possibility of giving Danny a chance at a safer life. The more Jason thought about it, the more the plan began to feel like the only responsible choice a father in his position could make. While Jason quietly wrestled with those life-changing decisions, Danny was experiencing his own emotional turmoil in ways that Jason could only partially see. The secret meeting with Charlotte had left Danny with feelings he was still trying to understand. For the first time in his young life, his emotions felt tangled between excitement, fear, and uncertainty. Their first kiss had been brief, but powerful, leaving an impression that lingered in Danny's mind long after they separated. Yet that moment of closeness came with a painful complication. Charlotte had explained that her life was becoming increasingly unstable and that she might be forced to leave Port Charles if Valentine had to run again. The possibility that she could disappear without warning unsettled Danny more than he wanted to admit. He did not want to pretend that the connection between them meant nothing. When Charlotte admitted that she felt the same way and kissed him once more before leaving, the moment became something Danny instinctively knew he would carry with him for a long time. To the adults around him, Danny's behavior might seem confusing or unpredictable, but Jason saw something deeper beneath the surface. He recognized that his son was growing up in the middle of circumstances that were far more complicated than any child should have to face. Danny was dealing not only with grief and loss, but also with the confusing emotions of adolescence, all while living in a world filled with secrets and dangers he barely understood. Watching Danny struggle through these experiences only strengthened Jason's resolve. The will he had been reviewing was no longer just a legal document. It had become something more personal and symbolic. Every line represented a promise that Jason was making to himself that no matter what happened in the future, Danny would never be left alone or unprotected. Jason knew that the decisions he made in the coming days could shape the rest of Danny's life. And as that realization settled deeper into his mind, he understood that time might be running out for him to act before the dangers of his world reached Danny in ways he could no longer control. Just as Jason believed he was finally putting the last pieces of his plan in place to leave Port Charles, something deeply unsettling emerged. He had returned to his documents one final time, determined to make sure every detail in his will was exactly as he intended before taking the next step in protecting Danny's future. The room was quiet, the kind of stillness that usually helped Jason think clearly. But as his eyes moved carefully across the pages, a small detail caught his attention. At first, it seemed insignificant, a subtle shift in wording that could easily have been overlooked. Yet the more Jason read, the more his instincts told him something was wrong. The language of the document was not identical to what he remembered approving. Certain clauses had been altered, others had been repositioned in ways that changed their meaning entirely. Slowly, the realization began to settle over him that the document in front of him was not the same one he had prepared. Jason's focus sharpened immediately. He went back through the pages line by line, comparing what he remembered with what now appeared on paper. The changes were not random. They were precise, deliberate, and carefully embedded within the legal structure of the document so that someone unfamiliar with the original version might never notice them, but Jason noticed. One section in particular stood out above the rest. The clause that determined Danny's legal guardian in the event of Jason's death had been altered. The name that now appeared there was not the one Jason had chosen. For a moment, Jason simply stared at the page, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be true. The will had been carefully drafted, protected, and stored through channels that only a handful of trusted people could access. Yet somehow, someone had reached into that protected space and rewritten a part of Danny's future. A chill ran down Jason's spine as the implications of that discovery began to unfold. The will was not an ordinary document lying in an unguarded drawer. It had been created through a controlled legal process, stored in a secure place, and handled only by individuals who understood the seriousness of its contents. The fact that it had been altered meant that whoever was responsible had both access and knowledge. This was not the work of someone acting impulsively or carelessly. It was the action of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly where to strike. Jason immediately understood that this was not coincidence. The alteration was too specific, too targeted to be accidental. Whoever had done this had not simply tampered with paperwork. They had taken a calculated step toward controlling Danny's life. Jason remained seated in the silence of the room, his eyes fixed on the altered lines as the weight of the situation settled over him. Only hours earlier he had believed he was making the right decision. Leaving Port Charles had seemed like the safest option, the one move that could finally remove Danny from the shadow of Jason's dangerous world. But now that certainty began to crumble. If Jason walked away from the city while this manipulated document remained in place, Danny's future could fall into the hands of someone Jason did not trust. Everything Jason had been preparing to sacrifice, his home, his allies, the life he had built, would suddenly mean nothing. Instead of protecting his son, leaving might deliver Danny directly into the control of someone who had already proven willing to manipulate legal safeguards for their own purposes. The longer Jason studied the document, the clearer another disturbing possibility became. Whoever had altered the will did not just know about it. They knew when to change it. The timing could not be ignored. Jason had only recently begun finalizing his preparations to leave Port Charles. Very few people were aware of that plan, and even fewer would understand why he felt the need to move quickly. Yet the changes in the will appeared precisely when Jason was nearing the point of departure. That meant someone had been watching him closely, perhaps for much longer than he realized. The realization unsettled Jason more than the document itself. It suggested that the person behind this interference had access not only to legal records, but also to information about Jason's personal decisions. As Jason leaned back in his chair, the quiet of the room began to feel oppressive. His mind moved through every possibility, every name, every potential threat that could have orchestrated something like this. The problem was not simply identifying who had done it. The real danger was understanding how far their influence might extend. If someone could infiltrate the legal safeguards meant to protect Danny, what else might they already control? The thought forced Jason to confront a terrifying possibility. This manipulation might not be limited to paperwork. It could be part of a larger strategy designed to trap him, forcing him into a position where any decision he made would ultimately serve the interests of whoever was pulling the strings behind the scenes. That possibility led Jason to a final, deeply unsettling realization. If someone had gone to this level of effort to alter the will, Danny was not just a secondary concern in their plan. He was the central target. The guardianship clause was not random. It was the key that determined who would shape Danny's future if Jason were no longer there to intervene. Whoever had engineered this change had effectively tried to claim control over that future in advance. Jason understood then that the danger surrounding his son was far greater than he had originally believed. The problem was no longer limited to the risks that came with Jason's enemies. It had evolved into something more calculated, something designed to exploit Danny's vulnerability. In the quiet aftermath of that realization, Jason felt the cold weight of a new fear settle in his mind. If someone had already manipulated the legal framework meant to protect Danny, then the timeline of this plan might stretch further back than Jason realized. The changes could have been made days ago, weeks ago, perhaps even longer, and if that was true, then the person responsible might already be several steps ahead of him. For the first time since discovering the altered document, a thought formed in Jason's mind that he could not easily dismiss. It was a thought that carried with it a chilling sense of urgency. There was a chance that the trap surrounding Danny had already been set in motion long before Jason noticed the change in the will. And if that was the case, Jason could no longer ignore the possibility that he might already be running out of time to stop it.